Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Shall we get started? So first of all, my name is Eric Malice. Some of you guys know me. I see some familiar names in here. That's awesome. Thank you for coming back. That's always nice. Anyway, so again, my name is Eric Malice. I am the Chief Product Officer, and I'm also the co-founder here at National Test Systems. Coming up on 25 years. I know, barely tell, right? Coming up on 25 years in the business. And ever since my brother and I started the company in the garage almost 25 years ago, while my brother was great at running a business, he knew how to manage inventory, knew how to make sure we got paid for our orders, made sure that the orders got shipped, just really knew how to do business things. That was never my focus. I was always more about the science behind everything. I wanted to understand, excuse me, I wanted to understand how the tests work. I wanted to understand how the drugs worked, how they interacted with the human body. I was really more of the technical guy, the science guy behind the scenes, trying to hopefully have all the answers to people's questions. And that's carried over. I mean, here we are almost 25 years later, and we are still making sure that education is a huge part of our platform. We always find more information better for you guys than less information. I don't see how that could, how you'd argue with that. And we do these webinars, we do blogs, we do trainings, we offer all these things because we want to make your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or at least a little bit more insightful, if nothing else. Excuse me. So just to speak of that, so we have, we recently, one of my reps, and one of our consultants, I don't want to name anybody, but I'm going to, even though I'm going to get yelled at later for it. I see a lot of familiar names. I know a lot of you guys work with Adam Kula. He was recently talking to to a potential client who was like, "Oh my God, you guys are giving training and education." And he responded like, "Why isn't everybody giving training and education?" These aren't paper towels. There's a lot of technology behind drug testing and the drugs that go along with it. So I think that it is important for education. We have a pretty good turnout today, so it seems like you guys agree with that, and that's great. I love being an educator, and I love sharing this information that I have with you, and hopes that you guys, again, that hopefully making your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or at least a little bit more insightful. So what are we talking about today? Today we're going to talk about what we call emerging drug threats, or trends in drug use and that sort of thing. We do this basically every year when we get the information, the publications from the DEA. Super helpful information. Firstly, we're going to talk about the National Drug Threat Assessment, which is something that they release every year. It's an 87-page report, and in addition to the things that we're going to talk about, it talks about transnational criminal organizations, money laundering, cartels, all that stuff. We're really going to focus on the drug part of it, but all this, it's a great report, and I'm thankful that they release this every year. 87 pages. I read it so you don't have to, but if you want to read it, there's a link over here on the left. You'll see it says handouts, and there's going to be links to all of the materials that we're discussing today. Also, just so you know, if somebody from your staff wasn't able to join us today, just know that we will post a recording of this webinar on our website. In fact, if you go to ntsbiz.com, our website, in the upper right, you'll see media. And you'll see a lot of recordings of webinars we've done. Most of the things we're going to discuss in here today are things we've done webinars on, whether at least one webinar or if not more on. So we've had a lot of webinars. Sorry, guys, by the way, there's technical issues I'm trying to sort through, so I apologize for my distraction. We will continue in a second. Sorry about that, guys. Anyway, yeah, so if you go to our website, you'll see all of our recorded webinars and a lot of good information in there. For example, we're going to talk about fentanyl. I've done 2 webinars on fentanyl, and there's always good information to be found there. Additionally, we've got about 20 minutes or so of a presentation here today. And also, if you look on the left pane, you'll see a button called questions. If you would put your questions there, I'll finish the presentation before I do get to the questions, but just know that once they're there, they're in line, so that's good. Excuse me. If for some reason we are unable to get to all of your questions today, just know that your consultant will reach out in the next day, couple of days, and they'll answer any questions we might have missed. They're going to also give you an opportunity for, suggesting other webinar topics or one-on-one training between you and your staff, either on this topic or any topic that you might deem helpful. This is a good example of a shallow dive, I like to call it. In other words, we're going to talk about fentanyl, but we're really going to talk about the trends in fentanyl. We're not going to talk about what fentanyl is. Again, I have hours of material on that already. So that's all there, or we can revisit it with you directly if you'd like. But we are going to focus mainly on the trends involving the substances we're talking about today. So just because we didn't talk about it doesn't mean that it's not worthy of a conversation. Just we need to pick and choose our battles when we're trying to keep you guys 20 minutes or so. Excuse me. So as mentioned, we have the National Drug Threat Assessment, which is a great document. We have an emerging threat report, which DEA has kind of slacked off on. That was typically my go-to to figure out which synthetic cannabinoids we're seeing, in other words, which K2s we're seeing, which synthetic cathinones, which bath salts we're seeing. But they've been kind of slack on that. What they did is they changed their focus a little bit to a new report they're calling the DEA Street. And of course, like everything government, that is an acronym. It's the State and Territory Reporting on Enduring and Emerging Threats. Street. Makes perfect sense, right? And then also we're going to talk about, we're going to be providing a lot of information for the National Forensic Laboratory Information Systems, NFLIS, which is a great source of information. They basically compile all the seizures from local, federal, county, anybody who wants to report to them. They encourage it, obviously. So we get to see a lot of what's being confiscated, what's being seized, which drugs are really showing up on the street. I hate to use their acronym, but they gave it to me, so I'm going to do it. All right, so first on our list would be fentanyl. And again, we've talked a lot about fentanyl. And just because I'm not going in a deep dive on fentanyl today doesn't mean it's not an important substance to be aware of. But this is one of the first charts that we have here that actually shows a little bit of good news. I've been accused of being doom and gloom because I always bring you these charts where it's like use is up, deaths are up, everything's bad. But this is one of the first times we're actually seeing a little bit of a downturn in fentanyl overdose deaths. It's still a very high number. It's still a very uncomfortable number. Fentanyl's still very much an epidemic. You definitely don't want to not test for fentanyl. I mean, it's definitely still out there, but it looks like we've kind of reached peak fentanyl overdose for whatever that's worth. Any little positive, I celebrate because it is such a big deal. We haven't seen, as you can look at this chart, we haven't seen a downturn since, was that 2013, basically. So we've had a good decade of incredible increase in fentanyl overdose deaths. And we're finally, it seems that we've turned the corner. And listen, by the way, you can see this chart ends at 2023, which is pretty current for DEA. Just know that I'm spending a bunch of hours, also reading reporting from federal government, from local law enforcement, from local media sources. So this does pan itself out. This seems to be the trend we are going on. It's not going to get back to 2013 levels anytime soon, but any little downturn, like I said, we're going to celebrate that. So, all right, next on our list would be nitazines. And again, we did we did host a webinar on nitazines. You can find it on our website. It is another synthetic opioid. This is something I would call a designer opioid. So when we talk about designer drugs, typically what we mean, or what I mean, Not everybody seems to have an agreement on what it's supposed to mean. But basically, this is a drug that was developed and then tested to see if it would be a viable alternative to other, in this case, opioids. And turns out it wasn't. We do this all the time. We do it with benzos. We do it with a bunch of different drug categories. We want to find a better pain medication that does as good as morphine or as, fentanyl without the addictive properties, without the possible harm involved. Excuse me. And that's where we see things that were developed or synthesized, whatever you want to call it, and then they were shelved. They're like, all right, this isn't as good as anything we already have. Let's shelf it. And then sure enough, some, bad actors will dig up the patent for this and they will make it in the clandestine lab. And that's where we get our designer drugs. So in this case, we're talking about nitazines, which are a powerful synthetic opioid. And again, they tried it in the 50s and they found it didn't really work. And we saw this really spike in 2021. Like a lot of these designer drugs, some of them are very much fatty. When I say fatty, in other words, we figured this out, nobody knows about it, let's use it. And then everybody figures it out and then they no longer use it. So as you can see by the charts here, we've seen a drastic decrease from its peak in 2021. So that kind of pans out as far as it being a fad. It's still a concern, but it's not like fentanyl where we just keep seeing it and seeing it and seeing it. Excuse me. All right, next on the report would be xylazine. So xylazine is an interesting one. Xylazine, which is often called Tranq, is a veterinary sedative, and it's not approved for human use, mainly just used for veterinary medicine, oftentimes with ketamine or with Valium as an anesthetic or tranquilizer to basically knock horses out. So it's a very strong drug. This was also being used to mix in with heroin or with street opioids to try and get a stronger effect on them, which is a lot of these things happen. Excuse me. This is also what I would consider to be a fad drug, in that the fact that this medication, I want to call it a medication because it is, and it has legitimate uses. This medication has such severe side effects in human use. That's why it's not approved for human use. Again, go back and watch the xylazine webinar. There's stories of necropsy of skin. It's really horrible. So I think this will also be kind of a fad where the harm outweighs the good. Not that there's good in street opioids, but the harm outweighs the good. I pulled this chart from that report just because I thought it was interesting. Again, this is from NFLIS, showing where we're seeing the most xylazine in the country. And you can see it's Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And it looks like all of my research is telling me that Pennsylvania was like the epicenter. Philadelphia was like the epicenter. And our first few reported xylazine overdoses and other issues with xylazine. I cannot find any supporting evidence as to why it was Philadelphia, but there we are. So whatever that's worth. Anyway, sorry, next on the list, it's still xylazine. Sorry, the interesting thing about xylazine with this other chart is we're seeing, again, it kind of pans out the fad theory that I have. We're seeing as far as its pill form, it's gone down a little bit. The powder form, it stayed about level. It did go up between 2022 and 2023, but only slightly. And again, I'm still confident 5 years from now, we're never going to hear about xylazine again. And I hope so. I really hope so. But I'm not always right. Just ask my wife. I'm not always right. All right. Next on our discussion would be heroin. So this is interesting. So heroin, of course, everybody knows about heroin. It's been around thousands of years. This chart is basically showing the seizures of heroin compared to the seizures of fentanyl. And you could see in about the first quarter of 2022, it just overtakes it drastically. So remember, keep in mind, and we talked about this with when we talk about our fentanyl, it takes, you have a semi truck full of opioids. The heroin is worth, I'm just making up numbers. Heroin's worth $1 million. The fentanyl truck is worth $50 million because it's so much more potent and so much more concentrated. It doesn't need a field of poppies to produce, naturally occurring opioids or opium to create the heroin. You can make fentanyl in a small laboratory, the size of a small apartment. So this is not surprising that we're seeing a huge decline in heroin use or heroin seizures. This one's actually seizures. But it also is not surprising that we see the fentanyl crossing its path on its way to a much higher level. But it's also nice that you can see that even the fentanyl seizures have gone down a little bit starting from the first quarter of 2023. So it's been level or dropping slightly. So again, I'll take any small bit of good news as a win. Next is methamphetamine. So methamphetamine, obviously still a major issue in most of the country. What we're looking at here, what this chart is showing, is the overdose deaths of psychostimulants, which essentially means methamphetamine. There might be some, other psychostimulants in there, but when they talk about psychostimulants in this, in this area, we're really talking about methamphetamines. So this is another example. We're actually seeing a slight reduction between 2022 and 2023 of methamphetamine overdose deaths. Excuse me. So while you can see this asterisk means they're still continuing to receive that 2023 data, all signs point to a slight reduction of overdose deaths for methamphetamine. Now, if we wanted to go back to the overdose deaths for fentanyl, we could probably attribute that to the availability and the awareness of Narcan. Like you can, in most states now, you can get Narcan over the counter. Here in Florida at our Publix, it's sitting right on the pharmacy counter. So if you have anybody in your life who is an opioid user, carry Narcan. But a lot of that is the cause for that reduction in overdose deaths. I think that awareness, and from everything I've read, that awareness has also helped us with this methamphetamine number. People are just more aware of people in their life who are, misusing drugs and could possibly need medical assistance should something like this occur. But again, any downward tick, I'm going to take that as a win. Here's the real interesting part about methamphetamine. So what this chart is showing is the number of domestic drug seizures. Again, this is the DEA, so most of it is at the border. These are domestic drug seizures of methamphetamine, and it is also reporting the kilograms seized. And this is in thousands, by the way. It's not just hundreds. So we can see, for example, in 2021, we had 298 seizure incidents. In other words, 298 busts, if you want to use that word. And it was about 186,000 kilograms of methamphetamine in total. So, that's good. We got a lot of methamphetamine off the street. However, you look at 2022, there was only 208 encounters or arrests or busts, but there were 477,000 kilos of methamphetamine seized in those busts. So basically what this is telling us is the importation or the smuggling of methamphetamine to this country is gotten a lot more. Well, it's gotten a lot bigger, first of all, but it's also gotten a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, it's gotten a lot more important, or a lot more, it's just larger, basically. So we're seeing a lot more of the methamphetamine brought in from a lot fewer incidences. So it's not the guy walking across the border with a backpack smuggling a kilo in. It's the semi trucks that are, that a million of them are crossing from Mexico to the U.S. for regular commerce, where they're stashing these methamphetamines, and they're hiding it in watermelons, and they're hiding it in cantaloupe, and they're hiding it in everything, basically. So we're getting a lot basically a larger import process, and it's a lot more. It's more profitable. Basically, is what it boils down to. Next on our list is cocaine. Again, we've all talked about cocaine a million times, so we know what that is. Here's the interesting chart I wanted to show you guys about cocaine. It is pretty consistent. And again, this is seizure. This one's from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And we see it's pretty consistent year to year. One thing that I found very interesting about this that I thought was interesting to share, or fun to share almost, is that we have a huge spike in the amount of cocaine that's seized between the months of February and April. And we was discussing this with one of my colleagues, and they're like, oh yeah, spring break, that makes sense. So I did do some research, and I can't find any legitimate reason why this spike occurs in the spring. Maybe the seas are easy to cross after winter's over, but I thought it was very interesting to see that spike in that time. And then if you look at the 2024 numbers for the end of the year, for July, August, September, we see it is a lot lower than previous years. So that's good. We're always happy to see, again, anytime we see a downtick, we're happy with that. All right, next I talk about cannabinoids or marijuana, THC, whatever you want to call it. Not much to be said here. That's not been said a million times, but I did want to share this chart showing how many states have already made it legal, both for personal, for medical, for medicinal, and some states with just CBD. And it really looks like the trend is going toward, at some point, we probably will see some sort of federal legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. Because the DEA didn't provide us any usage data, I had to do a bunch of research on that. But everything that I can find regarding marijuana use is that it's basically stayed flat amongst all age groups. So, there aren't 50 times more kids in middle school using weed now. It's basically remained flat for this entire time. So that's a good sign. If it's not an upturn, I take that as a win still. So, all right, next they discuss controlled prescription drugs. So controlled prescription drugs, and if you've been to one of my webinars before, you've heard me talk about this. Most, if not, well, maybe not most, but a lot of drug use and drug misuse begins in the family medicine cabinet. You've got, mom had some Valium from when she was going through a rough time. Kid's going to find it. Dad had a tooth pulled. It's got Vicodin in the cabinet. Grandma has Tramadol for her pain, or whatever it might be. But if you leave these medications unattended, history has shown again and again that we see a lot of people starting their path to drug use in the family medicine cabinet. And to clear that, it's pointed out further, here are the top 10 misused controlled prescription drugs. We've got amphetamines like Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin. We've got hydrocodone. If anyone's had a tooth pulled, you've had probably Vicodin or Lortab. We have alprazolam, which is Xanax, which is probably one of the top 10 prescribed medications in the country as well. Codeine, as I mentioned, oxycodone, clonazepam. A lot of these are benzos, which we expect because it's a very commonly prescribed medication. And as such, it's, ripe for the picking for somebody who's looking to, to try some drugs. It's in the family medicine cabinet. It's easy to get to. So do keep that in mind. If you've got an old, if you had a tooth pulled, you took your 3 Vicodin and you've got 10 left, just dump them, get rid of them. You don't want to leave them around for a family member to find and experiment with. One good thing about what we're talking about, controlled prescription drugs, this chart here is showing unaccounted for opioid narcotics. So opioid narcotics, Vicodin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, codeine, that sort of thing, mostly prescribed. We could probably put gabapentin on that list, or sorry, not gabapentin, tramadol on that list. We can see the number of unaccounted for opioids. And by the way, unaccounted for, fell off the back of a truck, robbed from a pharmacy, family members not disposing properly. So that number has got down a lot. We've definitely seen a huge reduction as people become more aware of, of which drugs may or may not be dangerous to people in their family. They're taking a little more care in disposing of these drugs properly. So of course, we love to see that. And then lastly, we've got new psychoactive substances, or NPSs. And basically, these are things we've talked about in our K2 webinar. We've talked about it in our bath salts webinar, in our gas station dope webinar, because most of these things are what we think about when we think of new psychoactive substances. So, of course, we've got our synthetic cannabinoids, like I said, K2 and Spice. Sorry. Then we have our synthetic cathinones, which are our bath salt class of drugs. The only one that's really new this time, and it only new to the list, it's by far new, is phenethylamines. So this is another, it's a stimulant drug, similar to ecstasy. We've all possibly heard of N-bomb. We've heard of C2B, Smiles. There's a bunch of different of these. Well, again, they're phenethylamines, so that's what they are. But they're basically stimulants with some sort of hallucinogenic effect, similar to ecstasy. It's not very common. We're not seeing a ton of it, but the DEA thought it was important to include it because it hasn't really been seen that much up until now. So it's good to keep it on your radar. They've been around since the 40s, I believe. I'd have to double check that. Sorry, I didn't pull that one. But they're there, basically. And then lastly, we talk about testing because National Test System, it's in our name. So pretty much everything that I've talked about, every drug that I've mentioned so far, we have a urine test for. The only exception would be phenethylamines. As of yet, there is not an instant urine test for those. It's something that will be watched, and if it looks like we're going to have any kind of real uptick in use of these things, and I guarantee you the tests will pop up before very long. But keep us posted if you're seeing it near you, because that helps as well, obviously. Next is oral fluid testing. Obviously, people like the non-invasiveness of doing oral fluids testing instead of urine. We've got almost everything we talked about here, including recently fentanyl. That's pretty new. And then sweat patch and hair testing is obviously always late to the game with testing for anything. But urine testing is usually the way we handle these things. So it makes the most sense. All right. I don't see any questions. So either I answered everybody's questions or you guys fell asleep or I'm having technical issues. Yeah, nothing. A couple things in chats. Let's see if anything is handouts and getting open. Disregard got it. Nitazene show. Gary, no, nitazines are their own drug class. There is a specific test for nitazines, and that's what you would need to test for in order to detect those. But that is something that's available. Nikki asking about recordings, and yes, they will be available typically within 48 hours. I mean, we're pretty quick about it. And anybody that wouldn't be able to get those links or had trouble getting the links, those links will also be posted there with the with the recording of the webinar. All right, listen, I kept you guys a long time today. Sorry about that. Usually get these things over in like 15, 20 minutes, but we had a lot of information here today, and I probably could have gone for another hour if they'd let me. But anyway, thank you guys so much for coming. I love having you guys here because it really shows that what we're doing, you guys do find helpful. You really do like having education. You like having information, and I love to share it with you. So I'm so glad you're here. I see a lot of little applause icons, but I'm really going to applaud you guys because that's the real star of the show. All right. Thank you so much. And until next time, keep on testing.